I had been planning the trip for months, needing a break from the city, from everything. I found a small cabin listed online, way off the main roads, deep in the forest in northern Vermont. It was the kind of place that looked peaceful in pictures, surrounded by tall pines, a small stream nearby, no neighbors for miles. But part of me felt a little uneasy even as I drove up the narrow dirt road leading to it. The closer I got, the quieter everything became. The only sounds were the tires crunching on gravel and the occasional caw of a crow. There were no other cars, no signs of anyone else in the woods, just the trees and the low fog that clung to the ground in patches. The cabin itself was older than I expected. Its wooden exterior had faded to gray, and the small porch sagged slightly in the middle. I parked in front and dragged my bags up the steps, the wood creaking under my weight. Inside, it smelled of old wood and dampness, like it hadn't been aired out for a while. Dust lay on the surfaces and cobwebs filled corners, but there was something oddly comforting about it, like it had been waiting for someone to come and disturb the stillness. The living room had a small wood stove, a threadbare rug, and a single armchair facing a cracked window. The kitchen was tiny, with a sink that looked functional, an old fridge that hummed quietly, and a stove that seemed usable. Upstairs, there was one bedroom with a double bed and a thin comforter. I unpacked my things, trying to shake off a sense of unease that had settled into the pit of my stomach the moment I stepped onto the porch. The first night, everything felt normal, almost too quiet. I made a fire in the stove, the flames casting long shadows across the walls. Outside, the wind rustled through the pines, a sound that could almost lull you to sleep if you didn't notice how completely isolated it made you feel. Around 2 in the morning, I woke to a sound, soft at first, almost imperceptible, like someone walking outside the cabin. I froze, straining to listen. The wooden floorboards of the porch creaked again. I convinced myself it was the wind, or maybe a deer, and eventually fell back asleep. The next day, I explored the small area around the cabin. The stream was shallow but clear, running over smooth rocks, and the forest was thick, the undergrowth wet and slippery. I noticed footprints in the mud near the stream, small, human, but not recent. They looked older, partially washed away by rain. I couldn't explain them. There were no other cabins nearby, no paths that led to a road. My rational mind told me it was probably just hikers or hunters from months ago. Still, I felt the prickling of unease. That night, the noises became more pronounced. Started around midnight. At first, it was soft thumps, like someone walking on the forest floor. Then there was scratching at the side of the cabin, faint but deliberate, not random. My stomach turned, and I didn't want to leave the bedroom, but curiosity edged me toward the window. I saw nothing, only shadows shifting between the trees, the fog swirling low to the ground. Every sound seemed louder in the silence, branches snapping underfoot, leaves brushing against the cabin walls. I could almost convince myself it was just an animal, but it felt too deliberate, too rhythmic. I decided to stay awake for a while. I sat by the window, the cold glass pressed against my forehead, staring into the darkness. The sounds came closer, circling the cabin, always careful not to make a direct approach. At one point, I saw a figure move between the trees, too tall and too straight to be a deer. My heart raced, my hands shook, but I couldn't leave the window. Eventually, I realized the figure was gone. No prints, no broken branches, nothing, just silence again. The next morning, I discovered the cabin door was slightly ajar, even though I was sure I had locked it. I checked the windows. All were closed and latched. Nothing was missing, nothing disturbed inside, but that sense of vulnerability hadn't left me. I tried to keep myself busy, chopping firewood and making sure supplies were in order, but every shadow, every small sound made me tense. I avoided the windows and stayed mostly in the main room, where the fire kept the cabin warm and the space felt contained. By the third night, I couldn't sleep at all. I could hear footsteps again, circling the cabin, slow and careful. I sat in the corner with a flashlight, trying to watch every window. Then I noticed something. Small scratches along the wooden walls of the porch, as if someone had tried to test the strength of the boards. They weren't deep, but deliberate, fresh. My chest tightened. Whoever or whatever had been outside had been close enough to touch the cabin, close enough to know it was occupied. I realized that this wasn't about ghosts or folklore. It was about someone watching, assessing, waiting. I spent the rest of the night preparing. I stacked firewood near the door, made sure the stove could be used as a barrier if needed, and kept a heavy stick nearby. I couldn't bring myself to sleep, too aware of every sound outside. When dawn finally came, the forest looked calm again, deceptive in its morning light. The fog lifted, and everything seemed innocent, but I knew it wasn't. I left the cabin later that morning. I packed quickly, double-checked that nothing was left behind, and drove down the narrow dirt road, heart racing with every snap of a branch along the side of the road. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway, where the sound of traffic and people felt almost painfully loud, almost unreal after the silence of the forest. In retrospect, I realized the cabin itself hadn't been unsafe in any traditional sense. It was solid, weathered but strong, with no signs of forced entry other than the slightly open door. What made it terrifying was the isolation and the sense that someone could be near you, unseen, without leaving any clear evidence. The forest, the quiet, the way the fog made shadows appear closer than they were. All of it amplified the fear, but it was all real, all human. There was no magic or monster, just the vulnerability of being alone in a place where someone else could watch and wait. I reported the scratches and the footprints to the local ranger station, though I never heard of anyone finding the person responsible. The cabin itself was abandoned again when I checked online months later. I don't know if anyone ever stayed there after me, and I don't want to, but the experience stayed with me, the sharp awareness of my own fragility, the feeling that human curiosity or intent can be more frightening than anything imagined. I never returned to that cabin, and I don't plan to, but leaving the forest and seeing people again, hearing normal city sounds, I realized that survival wasn't about running into danger, it was about recognizing it and getting away before it found you. That trip taught me that fear doesn't need ghosts or monsters. Real fear comes from isolation, from knowing that someone else could be near, watching, testing boundaries. It's the quiet realization that in a place like that, you are small, exposed, and completely alone. I made it out unharmed, but the memory of the footsteps circling my cabin, the scratches on the wood, the eerie stillness of the forest at night, those stayed with me, a permanent reminder of how real and human terror can be. I remember driving up the narrow, winding forest road, the tires crunching on loose gravel, the sun low and red behind the peaks of the Cascades. The cabin had always been a vague presence in family stories, mentioned only when talking about my uncle's obsession with the forest. He had stopped going there suddenly years before he passed, and I never asked why. The idea of inventorying timber for him after his death made me feel strangely responsible, like I was picking up a task he had abandoned without reason. By the time I reached the last stretch of dirt road, 3 hours from the nearest paved road, the trees had swallowed the tracks entirely, and my car's headlights barely cut through the thickening shadows. October in the Cascades was already cold, and a wind swept down the western slope that made the sparse leaves on the trees rattle like dry bones. The cabin itself was built in the late 1970s by hand, without permits, and it showed. The wood was weathered, grayed and rough, and the roof sagged in places, patched over with mismatched sheets of metal and shingles. The windows were grimy, layered with years of dust and pine sap, and the door's lock hung crookedly, one side barely holding onto the frame. My first thought as I parked and stepped out was that my uncle must have been tough to handle this place. It felt abandoned in the way some forests feel alive with silence, like the air was holding its breath, waiting. Inside, the cabin smelled of rot, dry pine, and that strange scent of old paper that had been left in the damp. The floorboards creaked under my weight, uneven and warped. Against one wall, I found old inventory logs, some yellowed and brittle, others more recent but still years old. I had expected to match them with the current forest layout, to trace the paths my uncle had taken, the areas he had marked for cutting or monitoring. But the maps and lists didn't match anymore. Trails had shifted, trees had fallen, A creek that had been a trickle in the notes had widened into a rushing path of water. The more I looked, the less sense it made. It was as if the forest had moved without warning, reclaiming what he had tried to organize. I had planned to spend only the day there, but the October weather made that impossible. Clouds gathered low, and the wind picked up to the point where leaves and small branches whipped against the cabin walls. I gathered some of the old blankets left in a corner, layered my jacket, and decided to stay the night. The cabin's old wood stove still worked, though the flue was clogged with creosote and soot. Lighting it was a slow process, scraping at rusted metal, coaxing the damp kindling into flame. When it finally caught, the warmth and the smell of burning pine filled the room. I felt slightly more comfortable, though uneasy. The walls seemed too thin to keep out the sound of the forest. That night, as I tried to sleep, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. There was a noise outside, faint at first, a kind of wood-on-wood contact. It wasn't like the wind. It wasn't branches rubbing together or a tree swaying in the breeze. It was deliberate, uneven, slow. Sometimes it stopped, only to start again in a different location. I could hear it circling the cabin, from the treeline to the slope behind, always just outside the range of the light from my small lantern. I sat on the edge of the bed, straining to hear, trying to convince myself it was some animal. Deer rubbing antlers, a raccoon dragging a branch, but it didn't sound like anything I knew. I remembered the logs. My uncle had kept track of every tree he cut, every section of timber he inventoried. He had walked these trails countless times, alone, marking and checking. And suddenly I realized something. If I followed the old paths, I would be walking routes that hadn't existed in years, paths that were either overgrown or entirely vanished. The sound outside matched nothing on the maps, nothing in my head. It was like the forest had folded itself differently around the cabin, shifting, moving, hiding. I lit a candle and walked to the window, peering out into the darkness. The moon was partially covered by clouds, casting quick, unreliable shadows over the forest floor. The sound stopped when I looked, started again when I turned away. It came from a distance at first, then closer, more deliberate, until I could almost feel the vibrations in the ground beneath the cabin. I wanted to open the door and check, to step into the night, but the rational part of me said no. Whoever or whatever was out there could have been doing any number of things. I reminded myself that logging operations in the Cascades sometimes left debris, old cut wood, and unstable ridges. A falling branch could sound like a hammer on timber. A rock rolling could mimic footsteps. I didn't sleep much. I stayed awake, listening, checking the logs over and over. By morning, the wind had died down, the forest quiet once more. I stepped outside carefully, scanning the slope. There were marks in the dirt around the cabin, impressions that looked like the ends of logs dragged across the soil, but there were no logs. Nothing had fallen. The ground was soft from recent rain, and the prints seemed fresh. They didn't lead anywhere clearly, and they didn't match the tire tracks of my car. I spent the rest of the day marking what I could of the forest with flags, trying to reconcile the logs with what was actually there. Some areas matched. Some were completely unrecognizable. I realized that years of wind, rain, and unmonitored growth had altered the land so much that even someone who had worked it intimately would struggle to identify it. The sounds from the night didn't repeat, and as I packed up to leave, I felt a mixture of relief and unease. I had survived the night, taken a rough inventory, and kept my uncle's work intact for the records. Yet the feeling of being watched by the forest lingered, a reminder that no human control lasts forever. Driving back down the winding road, I glanced at the cabin disappearing behind a bend in the trees. The sun had broken through the clouds, illuminating the peaks with a dull, sharp light. I thought about the sounds, the prints, the way the forest had shifted over a decade. It wasn't supernatural. It wasn't ghosts or monsters. It was nature reclaiming its ground, unpredictable and patient, reminding me that human plans are temporary. My uncle had stopped coming for a reason I might never know. Maybe he had sensed it too, the forest changing, moving in ways that no logbook could capture. By the time I reached the paved road, I felt a sense of closure. I had done what I came to do, cataloged what I could, Seen the forest in a way only someone who spends the night alone in a remote cabin can. The cabin itself faded behind the trees, but the memory of the night stayed with me. The creaking of old wood, the wind that wasn't wind, the forest that had shifted without asking. I drove on, knowing I had experienced something rare and dangerous in its subtlety, and that I would never forget how small and temporary a person feels when surrounded by an untamed landscape that moves quietly, deliberately on its own terms. I had planned the cabin trip with 2 coworkers after the layoff. The kind of layoff that doesn't just take your job, but makes you question everything you thought you knew about stability, about loyalty, about work itself. The cabin was tucked in northern Idaho, a few miles off a gravel road that wound through thick pine forests, and not far from an abandoned fire lookout. It was mid-July of 2011, and the summer heat pressed against the mountains like it wanted to trap everything in place. We didn't go to write or to hike seriously or to accomplish anything productive. We went to drink, decompress, and temporarily forget that we had been cast aside. That was the plan, or at least that was what we told ourselves. The cabin itself had that kind of history you can feel in the bones of the structure. It had been used decades earlier by wildfire spotters, who would spend months in the forest, eyes scanning for smoke and fire, ears listening for the slightest change in the wind. We found old supplies left behind, weathered and yellowed, some glass jars with rusted lids, a tin of matches that smelled faintly of smoke even though it had been sealed. Most of the walls were scratched and warped from age. The wood darkened where it had absorbed years of moisture. It smelled like pine, smoke, and dust. There was a small loft, a narrow kitchen, a stove that might have worked a few decades ago but now was just a relic, and a cupboard where we discovered the maps. They were the first real clue to the cabin's past. The maps were tacked behind the cupboard with old tacks, folded and curling at the edges. They were the kind you would expect wildfire spotters to use: topographical lines, ridges, water sources, old signal points marked in faded ink. At first glance, they were just relics, reminders of a system that had long since ended. But I found myself staring at them longer than the others. There was something almost hypnotic about the lines and points, the way the maps could suggest patterns and paths through the forest, like an old story hidden in ink. We laughed at them at first, joking about being responsible for spotting our own fires, drinking cheap beer while comparing ourselves to the people who had once depended on these maps for survival. The first night was warm and sticky, the kind of summer night that leaves your skin clammy and your thoughts wandering. We set up a fire outside, bottles of beer clinking in our hands, and as the night deepened, the sounds of the forest surrounded us. Cicadas screaming, owls calling, the occasional crack of a branch far away. The cabin didn't creak much. It seemed solid, almost stubbornly so, holding its years of history in a quiet, steady way. I went to the loft to sleep eventually, the others following a while later. The air cooled slightly in the night, and I fell into a restless sleep, the soft hum of the forest outside keeping me half awake. I woke suddenly, sometime in the early morning, to a faint sound that I couldn't immediately place. It wasn't a scream, a footstep, or anything dramatic. It was the soft scrape of paper, shifting slightly, from somewhere inside the cabin. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and that's when I noticed the cupboard. The maps were no longer in their original arrangement. They had been moved, rearranged, forming a rough loop, a circle of sorts around the cabin's interior. It was subtle. The tacks weren't torn, the papers weren't bent, but the difference was unmistakable. I froze for a moment, my mind running through explanations. Maybe one of my coworkers had gotten up for water, or checked the maps, or even been drunk enough to move them as a joke. But when I glanced toward their loft, both of them were still asleep, the faint glow of the moon revealing their bodies beneath the blankets. The cabin itself was quiet, the only sound the distant wind in the pines and the occasional shift of a branch. I stared at the maps for a long time, tracing the circle they now formed, trying to understand what had caused the change. By morning, I had convinced myself that it was probably nothing, just a trick of light or the wind moving the cupboard slightly. I told myself this as we ate cold cereal and drank coffee from the thermos we had brought. Outside, the forest looked ordinary, the abandoned lookout looming in the distance like a silent sentinel. The sun hit the treetops, and everything seemed normal. But when we returned inside to continue our day, the maps caught my attention again. They were still in the loop formation, as if whatever had moved them had wanted to make sure I noticed. We spent the day hiking the nearby ridges, talking in quiet tones about nothing in particular, and trying not to dwell on the maps. But as the sun fell, casting long shadows through the tall pines, I noticed something else. Small impressions in the dirt around the cabin, like footprints, faint but real, forming a rough outline around the structure. Not directly near the door or the porch, but tracing a loose circle that roughly matched the loop of the maps. I stepped closer to examine them, the dirt soft from a morning rain, and saw the prints were human-sized but irregular. They didn't belong to any of us. I spent the night watching for movement, keeping the cabin and the forest outside in my peripheral vision, but nothing appeared. The next morning, the prints were gone, erased by wind and sun. The maps remained in their circle, and for the rest of the trip, I paid attention to every creak, every gust of wind, every shadow that fell in the corner of my eye. I became aware of how much we rely on habit, on patterns, and how easily something small, like a rearranged map or a subtle loop in the dirt, can make the mind start to imagine intentions, stories, and presences where none may exist. By the end of the trip, we had emptied most of the beer, hiked the nearby trails, and even explored the fire lookout. It was a rickety, wooden structure, held together by rusted nails and old beams, with a view stretching miles across the forest and mountains. Looking out from the top, the cabin seemed tiny, insignificant, nestled in the trees like a forgotten artifact. And in that moment, I understood what the cabin had been. A temporary home, a place of observation, of waiting and watching, nothing more. The drive home was quiet, the gravel road crunching beneath the tires. I thought about the maps, the loop, the impressions in the dirt. In retrospect, it was probably some minor natural shifts, small disturbances, or even the random habit of someone who had been in the cabin before. But it had made me notice how easily our minds assign meaning to patterns, and how history lingers in places, shaping perception even decades later. The cabin had been a place of relief, a place to escape, and also a place that reminded me how subtle events can unsettle you without danger, without malice, without anything supernatural. It gave me perspective on my own fears, on my own reactions, and on how easily the world around us can feel like it is watching, even when it isn't. By the time I left, I felt lighter, as though the forest had absorbed some of my worry and given me back a sense of calm. The map stayed in my memory, but I never felt the need to return. I had seen, understood, and walked away, leaving the cabin and its quiet loops behind. I arrived at the cabin in late February of 2019, driving down a thin, snow-covered dirt road that curved through a forest of tall, bare trees. The sky was a uniform gray, low and heavy with the promise of more snow, and the air had that sharp, dry bite of late winter. I had rented the cabin because it was cheap and because it was off-grid, which I thought would be perfect for finishing my thesis. My previous attempts at writing had been interrupted by noise, distractions, and the endless hum of city life. I needed solitude, and the listing promised just that. Secluded, near a reservoir, it said, though it gave no name or location beyond that. I assumed I wouldn't mind. Seclusion was the point. The cabin itself was smaller than I expected. A simple rectangular structure, made of weathered pine, with a tin roof that glinted faintly under the winter sun. The porch sagged slightly in the middle, the boards warped from years of snow and rain, but the front door opened easily. Inside, the space was basic. A small kitchen area with a rusted sink, a wood stove tucked into the corner, and a narrow loft bedroom above. The walls were thin, and I could hear the wind rattling the structure like it was a living thing. There was no running water, no internet, no phone signal. It was exactly what I wanted, or at least I thought it was. The owner had given me specific instructions about the water pump. I was supposed to shut it off at night to prevent pressure issues. At the time, I thought it was a quirk of old plumbing. It wasn't until my second night there that I realized the pump was manual, outside, standing frozen in a thin layer of ice, and that the water was brought into the cabin by a system I would have to operate myself. At first, it was just inconvenient, the cold air biting at my fingers as I pumped water from the well. But as the days passed, it became a minor stress, a ritual that pulled me from my writing whenever I needed water for coffee or to wash dishes. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the laptop, the thesis, the empty pages that needed to be filled. The first night was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels heavier than silence. The wind moaned through the gaps in the logs, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear ice cracking on the reservoir, or so I assumed it was the reservoir. I wasn't sure. The property map was vague, and the owner had been evasive about the exact location. I wrote for hours, my fingers stiff from the cold, until I finally decided to go to bed. I shut off the pump and climbed into the narrow loft. The mattress was thin and uncomfortable, and the roof sloped so sharply that I could feel the ceiling brushing against my head if I moved. I fell asleep almost immediately, exhausted from the drive and the cold. I woke in the middle of the night to the faintest sound of footsteps. First, I thought I was dreaming. The cabin creaked constantly. It was natural to hear the settling of old wood, but these steps were different. They were deliberate, soft but definite, moving slowly around the cabin's exterior. My loft didn't allow me to see out the window without climbing down, and I didn't dare. I stayed frozen, listening to the crunch of snow under boots, or maybe just under feet, I couldn't tell. They circled the cabin at least twice before fading into the distance. I waited, heart hammering, until the rhythm of my own breath calmed me enough to drift back to sleep. The following morning, I inspected the area around the cabin. Snow covered the ground unevenly, thin in some patches, thicker in others. That's when I noticed them. Footprints, older than the fresh snow, frozen beneath it. They didn't lead up to the door or the porch. They didn't even come close. They started and stopped under the trees, circled around the cabin, and disappeared again into the forest. No tracks indicated a path toward the water pump, and no other signs of intrusion were visible. I photographed them with my phone and tried to convince myself it was wildlife or perhaps previous visitors wandering too close. But there was something unnerving about their pattern, their deliberate avoidance of the cabin itself, that set my mind on edge. Over the next few days, I became hyper-aware of every sound. The wind, the creaking logs, the occasional snap of a branch under snow. I checked the locks, the windows, even the underside of the porch. Everything seemed normal. Nothing was missing or damaged. I kept the water pump ritual, making sure to turn it off at night, and I focused on my writing as much as possible. The isolation was both a blessing and a curse. I could hear the reservoir water lapping faintly somewhere beyond the trees, a constant background hum that kept me company and unnerved me at the same time. On the 5th day, a snowstorm rolled in. By morning, several inches had accumulated, covering the old footprints entirely. The storm trapped me inside, the cabin suddenly feeling smaller and more oppressive than before. I worked through it, my eyes strained from the laptop screen, my back sore from sitting on the hard wooden chair. I stopped only to pump water, the cold air shocking me each time I stepped outside. The wind shook the cabin violently that night, rattling the roof and splintering old wood. The footsteps returned, but this time, they were accompanied by a low, dragging sound, as if someone or something was moving across the forest floor deliberately, almost pacing. I couldn't see anything. I didn't dare move. Sleep came in fits and starts, each one punctuated by imagined noises. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the cabin surrounded by smooth, untouched snow. There were no new footprints near the cabin, none near the pump, none anywhere in sight. It was as if the night sounds had never existed. I searched the perimeter, looking for signs of anything unusual, but there was nothing. I realized then that the older footprints I had seen before the storm could not have been recent. They were weeks old at least, buried under layers of snow until the thin crust above froze them into place. Whoever or whatever had made them had long since left. There was no threat. It was only my imagination that had amplified the noises in the dead of night. I spent the remaining days focused entirely on my thesis, my attention sharpened by the previous night's anxiety. I walked the nearby trails during daylight, trying to calm myself. The reservoir was a frozen expanse of silver and gray, its edges lined with skeletal trees. Wildlife tracks crisscrossed the snow, reminding me that I wasn't entirely alone in the forest. Nothing human approached the cabin again. The sense of unease gradually faded as I realized that the cabin, isolated as it was, offered no real danger, only the natural sounds of winter and my own heightened perception of them. By the time I packed to leave, the thesis nearly complete, I understood the rhythm of the cabin. Its noises, its quirks, the footprints, even the night sounds. All of it was part of living somewhere completely removed from civilization. There were no intruders, no threats beyond the cold and the wind. The sense of fear I had felt was entirely my own projection onto the unknown, the natural consequences of solitude in a place designed for seclusion. I locked the door behind me, turned the key in the weathered lock, and carried my things to the car. As I drove away, the cabin became smaller in the rearview mirror, eventually swallowed by the gray forest. I didn't look back again. The experience had been unnerving, yes, but it was over. I had faced the isolation and survived, with nothing more than old footprints, wind, and my own imagination to mark the time I spent there. The story of the cabin stayed with me, but in a different way than I expected. I learned that fear often exists in the spaces between reality and imagination, that the unknown is less dangerous than we assume, and that solitude, even when it feels threatening, is just a space to confront yourself. The thesis was finished, and the cabin, with all its quirks and minor scares, had given me exactly what I had come for. Focus, isolation, and a deep awareness of how easily the mind can turn ordinary things into shadows. That February, I left the cabin wiser, with the satisfaction of work completed and the clarity that what seemed threatening at first was, in fact, only the stillness of winter and the quiet rhythm of an off-grid life. I had planned the trip to the cabin months in advance, mostly as a way to get away from the constant noise of the city and the never-ending stream of responsibilities that seemed to follow me everywhere. The cabin was in the northern part of the state, tucked into a dense stand of pines that rose from the slopes of a narrow valley. I had chosen it because of the remoteness. I wanted silence, a place where I could feel completely alone for a few days. The drive there took longer than I expected, the winding roads narrowing as I climbed higher into the hills. The air changed too, carrying a cold, sharp scent of pine and damp earth that made the city feel impossibly distant. By the time I reached the cabin, the sky was already a dull gray, the kind that hangs low and makes the forest seem like a deep shadow. The cabin itself was modest, a wooden structure with a steep roof, weathered by years of wind and rain. Inside, the floorboards creaked under every step, and the air smelled faintly of dust and old wood, mixed with the faint mustiness of the unheated space. There was a small kitchen, a wood stove in the corner, and a single bedroom with a narrow bed. I had brought some food, a couple of lanterns, and a small stack of firewood. I unpacked slowly, noticing the silence around me, the way it pressed against the walls, filling every corner. It was the kind of quiet that felt alive, as if the forest itself was waiting, watching. That first evening, I set a fire in the stove and sat near it, listening to the wind shaking the branches outside. The shadows the fire cast seemed to move with the flickering light, stretching across the walls in ways that made the corners of the room feel farther away than they were. I kept the lanterns nearby, but I didn't need them. The fire was enough, though the longer I stared into it, the more I noticed the odd rhythms outside. The wind carried sounds, branches snapping, a thump of something hitting the ground, low rustles that seemed too deliberate for ordinary forest noise. I told myself it was just the wind or an animal moving through the underbrush, but even saying it out loud did little to calm the unease in my chest. Night came quickly, or at least it felt that way. I went to bed early, letting the warmth of the stove fade, and fell into a restless sleep. Around midnight, I woke to a sound that made my stomach tighten. It was soft, deliberate, a scraping noise along the side of the cabin. I froze, my ears straining. The sound stopped, then started again, moving in a slow, irregular rhythm. I got up, careful not to make any noise, and peered through the small window near the bed. The forest was black, only the outlines of the nearest trees visible against the sky. I could see nothing moving, nothing at all, but the sound persisted, soft and irregular, as though someone or something was tracing the side of the cabin. I waited, holding my breath, trying to convince myself it was nothing, some raccoon or deer. The scraping continued for another 10 minutes, then abruptly stopped. I lay back down, but sleep would not come. Every small sound made me flinch, the wind against the roof, a branch tapping against the window, even the shifting of the old floorboards. By morning, my nerves were raw, my body tense from hours of listening and waiting. I moved through the cabin in a haze, starting a fire, making coffee, trying to fill the silence with the ritual of morning. The next day, I tried to explore the area, to remind myself that the forest was just forest, that the sounds I had heard were natural. I walked along a narrow path behind the cabin, following the contour of the hill. The underbrush was thick, and the ground damp from recent rain. I saw tracks, deer, squirrels, and other small animals, but nothing unusual. Still, there was a feeling I couldn't shake, a sense of being observed, as if the forest itself had eyes. I tried to focus on the practical, collecting firewood, checking the stove, but every step carried the memory of that night, the sound of scraping and the way it had seemed too precise, too deliberate to be anything ordinary. That night, the sound returned, louder this time, closer, and not just along the side of the cabin. It moved under the windows, circling, making small thumps against the boards. I stayed in bed, heart racing, trying to measure the pauses between the noises, trying to understand the pattern. I realized the noises were not random. They were deliberate, careful, testing the boundaries of the space. I stayed awake until dawn, exhausted and tense, watching shadows move across the walls with the light of the lantern I had lit. In the morning, I found something that confirmed the unease. At the edge of the clearing, where the cabin met the slope of the hill, I saw prints in the damp soil. They were large, irregular, not quite human, not quite animal, and they led from the forest to the cabin and back. I followed them carefully, noting the spacing and direction. They stopped abruptly, disappearing into the thicker trees. I examined the cabin, running my hands over the sides, looking for marks. There were faint scratches along the boards, small but deliberate, matching the sounds I had heard. My stomach turned, but I forced myself to stay calm. I spent the next day gathering wood and supplies, staying close to the cabin, trying to maintain a sense of normalcy. At night, the noises returned again, but I noticed a change. They were slower, more methodical, as if whoever or whatever was making them had learned the boundaries of the space. I stopped trying to sleep, sitting near the stove with a lantern, staring into the dark. By the third night, I realized the presence outside was not going to leave until I did something about it. I spent hours inspecting the cabin, reinforcing windows and doors, moving furniture to create barriers, even making noise to test responses. The scraping and thumping came, always at the edges, never breaking through, but enough to keep me tense, alert, and exhausted. I made a plan to leave in the morning, pack everything quickly, and drive back down the mountain. The forest had claimed the silence I had sought. It was not a malicious force, not something beyond explanation, just something persistent, patient, and human in its curiosity. The dawn of my departure was heavy with fog. I packed the last of my belongings, checked every lock, and finally stepped into the clearing. The forest was quiet, the night retreating into the misty morning. I looked back at the cabin once, the boards marked, the earth disturbed, and understood the lesson the place had given me. Isolation was not just about being alone. It was about confronting the boundaries of your own awareness and the limits of what you can control. I drove away slowly, listening to the engine hum, the mist curling around the wheels, and left the forest behind, carrying the memory of the precise, patient noises and the undeniable weight of being watched. I had found the cabin online through a small listing on a local rental site. It was tucked deep into a valley in the mountains, far from any main road, surrounded by dense forest. I was looking for a break from the city, a place to clear my mind and focus on writing, and the isolation seemed perfect. The directions were vague, just a few landmarks and some mile markers, and I liked that. I wanted a place where I could be completely alone, away from people, phones, and noise. I packed my car with supplies: food, water, a gas stove, blankets, lanterns, and a small first aid kit. I left just before sunrise, hoping to reach the cabin by early afternoon. The drive was long and narrow, twisting through the mountains. The trees pressed close to the road, their branches scratching the car as I passed. The air smelled of wet earth and pine, and it was so quiet I could hear the tires crunch over the gravel and the occasional bird calling far above. When I finally arrived, the cabin was smaller than I imagined. A single-story structure with dark wooden walls, a steep roof, and a small porch. The paint was peeling, and the boards creaked under my weight as I stepped inside. The interior smelled faintly of mildew and old wood, but it was dry and solid. There was a small kitchen area with a sink and counters, a wood-burning stove in the corner, and a single bedroom with a narrow bed. I set my bags down and started unpacking, arranging everything so it was within reach. The first thing I did was light a fire in the stove, even though it was still daylight, just to feel some warmth in the cold, damp air. The wood cracked and hissed as it burned, and the shadows flickered across the walls, stretching the corners of the room. The first evening passed quietly. I chopped some vegetables, heated water, and ate by the fire, listening to the wind moving through the trees. Outside, I could hear branches snapping occasionally and the faint rustle of leaves. I told myself it was just the forest adjusting to the night. I had been in remote places before, and I knew the sounds of wildlife could be unsettling at first. By nightfall, I went to bed, leaving the lantern on the floor by the stove, just in case. I slept lightly, my body alert to every sound, every creak of the cabin. Around midnight, I woke suddenly. At first, I thought it was a dream, but then I heard it. A soft, scraping noise along the side of the cabin. I froze, straining to listen. The sound was irregular, slow, deliberate. It moved along the boards, pausing, then moving again. I stayed still for what felt like minutes, trying to convince myself it was a branch or some animal, but the timing didn't fit. It wasn't random. It was careful. I considered looking out the window, but the night was pitch black, and any movement might make it stop or worse, provoke it. The scraping continued for a while, then stopped abruptly. My pulse remained high long after. Sleep did not return easily. Every small sound, the wind shaking the roof, a branch brushing the window, made me tense. In the morning, I decided to check the perimeter of the cabin. I walked slowly around the clearing, my boots sinking slightly into the damp soil. The forest was thick, the ground covered with fallen leaves and moss. I noticed faint tracks along the edge of the clearing, prints that weren't mine, and they weren't clearly animal either. They were too large and irregular, with an uneven stride. They led from the forest to the cabin and back, stopping at the points where I had heard the scraping. I examined the side of the cabin where the noise had been the loudest. The boards were scratched in subtle lines, not deep, but enough to leave marks. My stomach sank. The scratches were deliberate, precise, not random. Someone had been here. I spent the next day on edge. I cut more firewood, checked the stove, collected water from the small stream nearby, and kept a careful watch over the cabin. Every noise felt amplified. A bird taking off from a branch, a log rolling down the hill, leaves brushing together. I stayed inside as much as possible, letting the daylight make the forest seem safer. But as evening approached, I felt it again, the subtle feeling of being watched. I lit the stove and left the lantern burning. The fire cast dancing shadows on the walls, and I noticed the shadows of the trees moving outside. At some point, I realized the sound had returned, faint at first, then closer, scraping and thumping in rhythm. I didn't move, just watched the walls, counting the intervals. By the third night, exhaustion and fear had set in. Couldn't sleep. Every sound felt like it was testing the cabin, probing the boundaries. The wind picked up, rattling branches and the roof. The scraping moved again, slower now, deliberate, testing the windows, the door frames, the edges of the porch. I stayed awake all night, leaning close to the stove, the warmth on my face, my hands clutching a small hatchet I had placed on the floor. I realized that leaving was the only solution. I couldn't stay and try to wait this out. Whoever or whatever had come here was patient, and I couldn't match that. In the morning, the fog hung low over the valley. I packed quickly, everything damp from the cold night. I checked the cabin one last time, running my hands over the boards. The scratches were still there, faint, dry, but unmistakable. The tracks in the soil led back into the forest, disappearing among the trees. I realized that the presence outside had never entered the cabin, never crossed the threshold. It had been testing, observing, but not violent. The forest had its own rules, and I had learned them, just as I had learned the limits of my courage. I drove down the mountain slowly, the mist curling around the car. The silence of the cabin stayed with me for hours afterward, a heavy, tense memory. By the time I reached the main road, the sounds of the city felt almost intrusive, the hum of engines and distant voices overwhelming after the isolation. I thought about the marks on the cabin, the tracks in the soil, and understood that isolation was not just a physical state but a mental one. Being alone didn't guarantee peace. It demanded awareness, patience, and respect for the environment. A week later, I returned home and unpacked. Everything I had taken felt familiar again, ordinary. But in the quiet moments, I could still hear the soft scraping of the boards, the methodical steps in the soil, and the way the forest had observed me. I knew I would go back someday, better prepared, with respect for the patient persistence I had encountered. The experience taught me the value of caution, of understanding the limits of solitude, and of recognizing that nature can be unnerving not because it is supernatural, but because it is deliberate, watchful, and indifferent to human expectations. It was a clear lesson, one I would not forget, and it ended not with chaos or terror, but with understanding. I had left the cabin behind, but the awareness of its presence stayed, a quiet, lasting impression of what it means to be truly alone. I had been driving all day to get to the cabin, a place my friend's family owned deep in the woods of northern Wisconsin. The GPS barely worked once I left the main highway, and I followed a winding gravel road that grew narrower the further I went. The trees were tall and thick, mostly pines and oaks, their branches heavy with the late autumn leaves that rattled against each other in the wind. The sun was low in the sky by the time I turned onto the final dirt path, and the forest around me was dense enough that it already looked dim even though it was still mid-afternoon. I hadn't been out here alone before, but I wanted a quiet weekend to clear my head, away from the city noise and constant pressure at work. The cabin appeared after a sharp turn in the path, small and weathered, sitting at the edge of a clearing that overlooked a frozen pond. The wood was dark and slightly rotting at the corners, and the roof had patches where shingles were missing. A thin layer of frost coated the steps and porch railing, and the air was sharp and cold. I parked my car next to a small shed and unloaded my gear, the crunch of my boots against the frost-covered ground the only sound beyond the wind moving through the trees. The forest was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like it's pressing in on all sides, but I told myself it was normal. It was late November, and animals were either hibernating or tucked away in the woods. Inside the cabin, everything smelled faintly of dust and wood polish. It had been closed up for months, and the air was stale and heavy. I opened the windows to let in the cold breeze, watching the dust particles swirl in the thin shafts of light from the setting sun. The living room had an old couch, a small wood stove in the corner, and a kitchen table that looked like it had been scratched by decades of use. I laid out my backpack and started a small fire, stacking dry kindling I had found in the shed and lighting it with a match. The smoke curled up the chimney and the warmth spread quickly, though the cabin still smelled faintly of damp wood. I spent the next hour checking the cabin, walking carefully across the wooden floors that creaked underfoot. The stairs to the loft were narrow, and the railings were loose in spots. The bedrooms were small, with thin mattresses and blankets folded at the foot of the beds. The windows were dusty and cracked in places, letting in occasional gusts of wind that made the old wood groan. The forest outside was visible through the glass, a wall of trees stretching in every direction, and I could already feel how isolated I was. There was no other building for at least half a mile, and the nearest road was a long hike through the woods. Night fell quickly. I cooked a small dinner over the stove and sat at the table, listening to the forest outside. The wind moved through the trees with a low, constant hiss, and every now and then I could hear the snap of a branch breaking somewhere nearby. It was the kind of sound that makes you aware of every shadow, every movement, even when nothing is there. I tried to focus on a book, but my mind kept drifting to the noises outside. The cabin was completely still aside from the occasional groan of the wood settling and the crackle of the fire. Around midnight, I woke suddenly. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard it again. A soft scraping sound, like something heavy being dragged across the porch. My heart rate sped up instantly. I lay still for several minutes, trying to figure out if I was imagining it. The scraping came again, closer this time, a slow, deliberate movement against the wood. I gripped the small flashlight I had left on the table and unzipped the tent part of the loft slightly, shining the beam toward the front door. Nothing. The porch was empty, the snow undisturbed except for the faint frost glinting in the moonlight. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting in a chair near the fire with the flashlight close. Every sound made me flinch. The wind rattling the windows, the floorboards creaking, branches falling somewhere in the dark. The cold made my hands stiff, even with gloves on, and the cabin's walls seemed to press inward with every gust of wind. The scraping didn't return, and I convinced myself it must have been a branch caught in the porch railing, moving slightly in the wind. But even that explanation didn't fully ease the tension. By dawn, I was exhausted. The first light filtered through the cracked windows, turning the forest outside a dull gold. I moved cautiously around the cabin, checking doors and windows, making sure everything was secure. The porch was empty, the snow still undisturbed. Whatever had made the sound the night before had left no trace. I went outside, breathing in the cold air, noticing small details I hadn't seen in the dark. The frozen footprints of a deer near the edge of the clearing, a small hollow where the wind had blown snow into a drift, the frozen pond's thin layer of ice glinting in the morning sun. The world looked calm, ordinary, and entirely normal. I spent the morning breaking firewood, maintaining the stove, and making coffee. The cabin felt safe in the daylight, ordinary even. The groans and creaks of the wood were natural, and the sounds of the forest were no longer frightening. The isolation that had felt overwhelming in the dark now seemed peaceful. I took a walk around the perimeter of the clearing, noting the frozen tracks of wildlife and the natural shifts in the forest floor. The wind rustled through the branches, and for the first time since arriving, I felt truly alone, but in a comforting way. By mid-afternoon, I was packing up to leave. I checked the cabin one last time, making sure the fire was fully out and all windows and doors were secured. The small comforts I had created for myself, the fire, the organized gear, the neat layout of my pack, made the cabin feel lived in, even though it was empty. I took one last look at the frozen pond, noting how still the forest was and how bright the sunlight made the snow and ice. The cabin behind me seemed quiet and inert, the dark shadows of the night gone, leaving only wood, frost, and pine. The drive back along the gravel road was slow, my mind replaying the night's tension. The scraping sound, whatever it had been, was the only anomaly. Everything else was explainable. The wind, the settling of the cabin, the distant movements of animals. But the experience had left an impression, a heightened awareness of space, sound, and isolation. I realized that fear is not always about danger. Sometimes it is about uncertainty, the unknown, and being alone in a place where every sound is amplified. By the time I reached the main highway, the tension had faded completely. The cabin remained behind, silent and unremarkable in the afternoon light. I had survived the night without incident, understood every noise and shadow, and left the forest in control of my surroundings once again. The experience taught me how small factors, wind, old structures, darkness, can create intense fear, but also how reason and observation can return clarity. The cabin had challenged me, made me hyper-aware, and reminded me of my own capacity to endure isolation. I returned home, carrying the memory of the forest and the quiet cabin, the frozen porch, and the scraping sound that had startled me in the night. It was a reminder that even in a simple, realistic scenario, fear can feel overwhelming, and clarity only comes with observation, daylight, and reflection. The weekend had been a test of patience, awareness, and composure, and I had passed. The cabin was still there, unchanged, a place of wood and frost, quiet in the day, imposing in the dark, and entirely real. I knew I could go back anytime, prepared for whatever sounds the night might bring, but confident in my ability to remain grounded and aware. I drove into the mountains just before sunset, the road narrowing to a single lane of packed dirt and gravel, flanked on both sides by dense pine and spruce. The forest was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind and the crunch of my tires over loose rock. I had planned the trip for months, wanting to test my survival skills and enjoy a weekend alone in the cabin my uncle had inherited years ago. It was remote, reachable only by that old forest road, and I felt a mix of excitement and apprehension as I rounded the last bend and saw the cabin emerge between the trees. The cabin was small, made of dark wood that had weathered many winters. The roof sagged slightly in the middle, and some of the shingles were missing, letting in slivers of light from the fading sun. A thin layer of frost coated the steps and the railing of the porch. The forest pressed in closely around the clearing, and the late afternoon sun made the shadows stretch long and dark across the ground. I parked my truck near a shed and unloaded my gear carefully, the sound of my boots crunching against the frost-covered dirt the only noise beyond the occasional creak of a branch. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of mildew and old wood. It had been closed for months, maybe even longer. Dust collected on the furniture, and the thin rugs were stiff from neglect. I opened the windows to let in the cold air and sunlight, watching the dust particles swirl in the light beams. The living room was sparse. A small couch with worn cushions, a wood stove in the corner, and a table scratched and dented from decades of use. I laid out my pack and started a small fire, using what I had brought and some dry kindling stored in the shed. Smoke curled lazily up the chimney, and the warmth spread quickly, though the air still carried the damp smell of the old forest wood. I spent the next hour walking through the cabin, checking doors and windows. The floors creaked with every step, the wood settling under my weight. Upstairs, the loft had two small beds with thin mattresses, blankets folded neatly at the foot of each. I made sure everything was functional. The stove worked, the windows could close securely, and there were no obvious weak spots in the walls or floor. Outside, the forest loomed close, the trees tall and tight enough to obscure anything beyond the clearing. The isolation was complete, and it felt heavier as the sun dipped below the horizon. Night came quickly. I cooked a simple meal over the stove, the sound of bubbling water and sizzling oil filling the otherwise silent cabin. The fire cast dancing shadows across the walls, the flickering light giving depth to the worn wood and the old furniture. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, and I could hear occasional cracks of branches or the fall of dead leaves on the frozen ground. I went to bed early, layering myself under thick blankets, feeling the chill that still seeped in through cracks in the walls. The darkness was complete, and every sound outside seemed amplified. Around midnight, I woke. At first, I thought it was the wind, but then I heard it again. A slow, deliberate scraping sound on the porch, like something heavy being dragged across the wood. My heart rate jumped. I lay still, listening carefully. The sound repeated, soft at first, then slightly louder, moving in small, irregular arcs across the porch. I grabbed the flashlight I kept on the table and unzipped the tented loft slightly, shining the beam toward the front door. The porch was empty, frost glinting faintly in the moonlight. The trees surrounding the clearing were still, but the wind had changed, carrying with it subtle noises that made me tense. I stayed awake the rest of the night, sitting near the fire with the flashlight within reach. Every small sound, the groan of the cabin as it settled, the creak of the roof, the occasional snap of a branch, felt magnified. The porch remained empty, but my mind traced every possible explanation, every shadow becoming a potential presence. The wind rustled the pine needles, and even that simple sound made my senses tighten. I checked the doors repeatedly, listened to the forest outside, and stayed alert, knowing that in such isolation, any lapse in attention could leave me vulnerable. Dawn arrived slowly, the light pale and diffused through the trees. I unzipped the loft fully and stepped outside, examining the porch and the ground around the cabin. The frost had shifted slightly with the night's wind, but there were no footprints, no disturbances in the dirt, nothing to indicate someone had been present. The clearing looked calm and ordinary under the morning light, the forest seemingly indifferent to the tension of the night. I walked around the perimeter, noting the subtle details. Tracks of deer in the frost near the edge of the woods, small drifts of leaves blown by gusts, the frozen pond at the edge of the clearing reflecting the gray sky. I spent the morning breaking small pieces of firewood, tending the stove, and making coffee. The cabin felt secure in daylight, every noise explainable, every shadow grounded in reality. The isolation I had felt the night before became peaceful, the forest quiet and unthreatening. I walked through the clearing, observing the small details of the environment. The frost coating the tree branches, the distant hills softened by mist, the occasional bird taking flight from the treetops. The experience of the night had left me hyper-aware, noticing every movement, every subtle change in the forest, and I realized how much my imagination had amplified ordinary sounds in the darkness. By late morning, I began packing to leave. I carefully ensured that the fire was completely out, that all windows and doors were secured, and that nothing was left behind. The cabin, once oppressive in the night, now appeared sturdy and ordinary, a simple wooden shelter in the middle of the forest. I took one last walk around the clearing, breathing in the crisp air, noting the stillness of the forest and the sharpness of the frost on the ground. The tension from the night had completely lifted, replaced by a clear understanding of the environment and my own response to it. I drove back slowly along the gravel road, replaying the night's events in my mind. The scraping sound on the porch was likely caused by frost-shifting wood, small animals, or wind catching loose materials. The shadows and eerie feeling were products of isolation, darkness, and a heightened sense of awareness. Everything about the cabin, the forest, and the clearing was ordinary, explainable, and entirely real. The fear I had felt was a reaction to uncertainty and vulnerability, not an external threat. When I reached the main road and the sun was fully up, the forest and the cabin receded behind me. The memory of the night remained, sharp in its intensity, but the clarity of daylight provided perspective. The experience taught me that fear is often rooted in perception, that isolation can magnify minor environmental factors, and that careful observation can restore understanding. The cabin had been a perfect test of patience, awareness, and composure. I had navigated the night without incident, understood every sound and shadow, and left the forest knowing I could return at any time, prepared and confident. By the time I reached my home, the memory of the forest and the cabin stayed vivid. The night had been unsettling, but entirely explainable. The small details, the frost, the shifting wood, the distant sounds, had combined to create a profound experience in perception and awareness. I knew I could go back, knowing that isolation and darkness can challenge the mind, but that careful preparation, observation, and understanding can turn fear into clarity. The cabin, now calm and silent in memory, remained a place of wood, frost, and light, entirely real, entirely ordinary, and completely manageable with respect, attention, and patience.